Hello everyone and welcome to another instalment of my SAB Lizard build. In videos 1 and 2 we had a look at SAB the company. We installed the landing gear, we installed the servos and we installed the vector thrust pipe. Today I've now received the wonderful JetCat P130Rx, which is going to be powering this plane, and it's an absolute beast. So we're looking at about 7 or 8 kilos worth of plane, I believe, and 13 kilos roughly of thrust kicking out the back with a 3D vector pipe. So it's going to be a load of fun. Let's get this beast installed along with a few of the wires to go through it, and then I'll just leave all the final setup in the next video before we can finally start having some real fun getting it up in the air. Let's get to it. Now it may not be as exciting as actually installing the turbine. However, before fixing that in permanently, I want to finish up all the wiring for the back end of the plane. Because once the turbine's in, it's going to be a lot harder to get fingers and hands in to actually get those wires through. Now, I'm going to be using the Powerbox premium servo wire for the wings. I'm actually going to be using the premium micro wire for the 2 rudder servos. As they're tiny servos, they don't pull that much current, and for small applications, this micro wire is sufficient, and it's that much lighter than the standard premium one, which is going to be ideal for our 3D jet and keeping things light. So micro for the rudders, premium for everything else. Let's get it installed so we can get back onto the fun part of the turbine. We're starting by measuring how long our extension leads need to be. So we guide them through roughly where they're going to go and leave them a bit long. We then crimp one side of the wires using your preferred method. I have a couple of videos on crimping, so I'll leave the links in the description below. In the case of the micro wire, we're going to need to solder it after crimping as well, otherwise the wire is just a little bit too thin and can slip out of the connector. Normally I would use a support or even the Powerbox 1-for-1 connectors for connections like this. However, given that we're trying to keep this plane as light as possible, on this occasion they're just having a hole drilled and then they're getting glued into place. So just drill, thread the wire through and apply a little bit of CA. You'll also see that I've marked on each side of the connector which is the negative and which is the signal, making sure that future connections can be done safely and without mistake. And then repeat the same for the other side of the model. We can also use our tape trick, which allows us to keep the wires in place really securely and also really light. Don't worry about the front end for now, we'll get to that a little bit later. Onto the turbine then. Using the supplied spacers, we're going to test fit the turbine and mark where it is that we're going to need to drill our holes. We're going to double check and then drill them through. My JetCat uses a 4mm bolt as opposed to a 3mm one, so rather than using the provided nuts and bolts, I'm going to be using a 4mm set that I have along with some captive nuts underneath the mounting brackets. We're going to screw them down and test fit everything again. Time for the push rods. These are made out of carbon rod and threaded ends. First of all, we're going to assemble them and test fit onto the servos and vector system itself. We're then going to cut to length so it's ideal for our particular setup. Once happy with the lengths, we're going to epoxy everything together, leave it overnight, and then finish it up with some heat shrink. Once all that's done, we're going to test fit it inside the model again, adjust the length of the ball links to make sure that they're at exactly the right length so the servo is centered and as is the vector thrust, and then we're going to screw everything down. SAB include everything that you need in order to run this model with a turbine. So we take the fuel tank and all the accessory pack. We're going to assemble the clunk with a copper part in the middle so the clunk can't bend back on itself, and then we're going to bend the breather. A neat little trick for you here is to use something round to force the copper around it and prevent it from kinking. So gently just bend that around something round. I'm using the actual lid of the fuel tank. Assemble the bung, insert it into the tank, twist the tubes as required so they're at the right positions, and screw down. Before screwing the turbine down, it's worth mentioning a couple of things. I did end up reducing the number of spacers for the turbine from 2 to 1. I also ended up having to lift up one of the two servos slightly, as SAB actually recommend in their manual. This was to allow the rudder vector thrust push rod to go through unobstructed. Otherwise, the bolts that hold the turbine in place were in the way. For added distance, I also changed the bolts that hold the turbine in place for ones that have a smaller head. I also opened up the wood slightly under the turbine next to where the vector elevator pushrod is, just to assure a totally bind-free operation. Now that everything else is in place, it's time to screw the turbine in and make its final connections. It's also worth mentioning that even though in this video you may not have seen me tighten screws up massively or always use Loctite, that's because of the video. After filming, all nuts and bolts have been removed, coated with Loctite and screwed in and ground down. So they're all nice and secure, and I recommend that you do the same. You don't want anything coming loose in flight. And that's it, the whole back end of the Lizard is now finished. So we've installed the JetCat P130Rx. We've finished setting up all the vector system, both in left to right and up and down motions. We've also started running through the fuel lines and all the electricals forwards. Now, we've set up the fuel tank, but we haven't started connecting everything up. Simply because that's going to take me a bit of time to get all the wires where I want them and need them, all for the right C of G, and keeping everything nice and neat and tidy. So I figured I'll leave that for the next episode, where I'll show you where I end up putting all those wires and tubes. So if you want to do the same, you at least know where I put everything. But the next episode itself is actually going to be the final setup of the model. So I'm going to be showing you how I set up my Powerbox core radio for a model like this one. We're also going to be setting up the brand new Powerbox Pioneer, which is going to be controlling everything. And we're also going to be setting up the iGyro SAT, which is the gyro which is going to help us fly that little bit smoother on the flying surfaces. And it's going to have a bit more control over the vector system, which is going to allow us to do all those fun hovering and 3D maneuvers. So you're not going to want to miss it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave us a like. Any comments, you know where to go. Subscribe if you aren't already. And thanks for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. I'm Martin Pickering, and I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave us a like, and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Subscribing is always free and just means that YouTube shows you my latest videos once uploaded. And with all the cool projects, models and events coming this way, you're not going to want to miss them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.